I want to introduce our first speaker. You're going to enjoy this guy tremendously. I've had the great pleasure to be with him a couple of times. Our speaker this morning's worked in communications for the World Bank Group and a California NPR affiliate. Volunteered in the U.S. Peace Corps in Kenya, worked as a deckhand on an ecotourism ship, and is now the director of millennial engagement at Monsanto. He holds an undergraduate degree in communications and a master's degree in cross-cultural negotiations. Help me welcome a true expert in social media that'll help us explore the various platforms and the way can we most effectively use them. Please welcome Vance Crowe.
Well, thank you. That was an incredibly upbeat introduction. I hope I can keep pace with that. So, my name is Vance Crowe, and I am the curiously titled Director of Millennial Engagement for Monsanto. And I say it like that because when I go out into the world and I'm talking with people, the very next thought in their minds is always, what in the heck is a Director of Millennial Engagement, and why are you talking with me, right? And so I'll talk just a little bit about why Monsanto has a Director of Millennial Engagement, but that's not actually why I'm here. What I'm here to talk about today is the social media side of farming. And to be completely candid, I come from very far away from agriculture. So when I say this, I say it with a level of humility. I don't actually know what it's like to till the ground, and I don't actually know what I'm asking you to do when I say you need to get out on social media with all of the other responsibilities that you have. But I have seen the power of social media, and I do know that people that want to generate fear about farming and modern agriculture are certainly there. And I have also seen the power of being able to get people that are cultivating the land out talking with people that would never otherwise interact with them. And I believe it's so important that it was worth driving after the longest week probably of my entire life, driving 3 hours last night to get here and leaving right away to head back to work, because this was, I was told, a quite important group. I heard about the process to get here, and I'm honored to be here. So, to start, why does Monsanto have a Director of Millennial Engagement? Well, for many, many years, the company thought, we really only have two audiences that we're reaching out to, our farmer customers and our investors, right? And so that's what we did, and we got really good at understanding what are our farmers' concerns, what problems do they have, and how can we solve those problems. And then we also figured out, hey, we have investors. How do we go build relationships with them, talk about the concerns that they have? And a lot of people are surprised to learn we're considered one of the most transparent companies in all of Wall Street. We're considered the gold standard of that. And so we held on to that really tightly. Look, we're really good with these two audiences. But what we forgot is that in between these two poles happen to be billions and billions of people, right? People that we don't sell anything at all to, and yet they feel very, very strongly about where their food is coming from, who's producing it, how it's getting produced, what's going on with it. And for a long time, we didn't think we needed to interact with them. And we now see the result of staying out of that conversation, which is people are so afraid that they demand labels on their food. Or they literally go to our factories where jobs are needed all over the world and try and tear down the fences and demand that we leave. Or they hold things like tribunals to hold Monsanto and the people they work with guilty of genocide in kangaroo courts, right? This is really, really serious. And Monsanto took a look at that and said, we need to change. We have to take responsibility for figuring out how can we contribute to lowering the amount of fear that's in modern agriculture. And so they completely redesigned all of the way that we were doing communications. And one of the things that they did was that they hired a team of people to go out and talk with actual regular consumers, figure out what are the questions that they have, what are the problems that they have, are any of their concerns something that we should listen to and react to, or are some of them just ones we need to address? And so I was hired in that. And when we think about why would we call this the Director of Millennial Engagement, it's probably worth thinking about why do we name generations? Why do we do that, right? Why do we have baby boomers and Gen X and Gen Y and millennials? Well, it's not to represent that there are more young people coming. We know there are more young people that are getting older every day. That's the nature of human beings or the lifespan, right? But the reason that you name generations is to represent that there are new ideas that in the past maybe were colliding together out in the ocean. They weren't really amounting to much of anything, but eventually they form into a pattern because of changes to technology, or changes to culture or government. And instead of those randomly crashing into one another 12 miles off the shore, they start getting into synchrony. And that synchrony builds into a giant tidal wave of culture that will one day crash onto the shore of society. Now, it won't become society, but it will change the shape of that shore. And so my job, as someone that has been tasked with helping us figure out how do we slow down that fear that is burning in our civilization about the most advanced agriculture, how are we going to do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to try and get to the top of that wave, where the newest ideas are about to diffuse into society, and figure out how to engage with people that are at the top of that wave. So that includes going to synthetic biology conferences at Berkeley, or art schools in downtown Manhattan, or pubs in Scotland, which is not a bad part of my job, or being here with you, right? You all were selected to be here because you are the top, because you see potential. And so when we go out and talk, we are trying to figure out how do we engage with the people at the top of that wave. And what I was asked to talk about is how to do the social media side of farming. And what I decided I would do today is to try and take maybe something that many of you know and create a shift in the way that you think about it. So I'm going to try to do some things that I've actually never talked about in public before. We'll see if it works, but I was told this was valuable enough that I would try it here, okay? So when we think about social media, how many of you are on Twitter? Okay, great. I love Twitter. How many of you on Facebook? Okay, Instagram? Snapchat? Other media? Anybody run a podcast? Anybody have a YouTube channel? Okay, interesting. When we think about engaging in social media, it's really easy to think about like, oh, hey, I just put posts out there, I'm trying to have conversations. And that's one way to do it, right? That's the way that regular people do it, right? But you're not being asked to be regular people, you're asked to be leaders. And so when you think about the way that you can conceptualize what's going on the internet, it's instead of just going out to have conversations, but is it possible to create what we think of as internet artifacts? And by artifact, I mean something that someone else can walk along when they didn't know you, they didn't have any connection with you, they had no idea what world you came from, and they discovered something that you built. And it's so interesting that they decide they're going to take a look at it. They're going to, maybe inquire more about it. They're going to scrape the dust off, just the same way that if you were walking through the jungle and you encountered some sort of monolith, you would do, right? So if you think about getting engaged in social media as just, hey, I'm going to go out and talk, that's one level of doing it. But perhaps you can think about, how can I build something so that when someone else encounters it, it changes the way that they think? And maybe it doesn't do it in some grandiose way. Maybe it just edges them in another way than what they were thinking before. So we'll come back to this concept, but I wanted to talk just a little bit about how people know what they know. And I wanted to do that by talking about this phenomena called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I am certain every person in this room, particularly anybody that raised their hand high when they were talking about I've been on social media, will understand this effect. You see, on this axis, we're going to chart the confidence that people have in their expertise about what they know about a subject. And on this axis here, we're going to talk about the time spent studying something. Now, this is not a joke. This is a real phenomena. And it turns out that it happens in all domains, but something that you maybe have seen when somebody goes away to school, or they watch a documentary, or they read a book about something for the very first time, they just read one or two things, the confidence in their expertise goes from 0 all the way up to about 95%, right? You've probably seen this when you see people that watched one documentary about farming and now have their PhD in what they're going to talk about out in the world, right? But there's an interesting thing that happens. There is a point in which, if you keep studying something, you hit a peak, and then you start going down. And you go down in terms of the more that you learn, the more you become frightened about how much you don't know. And you start just tunneling down, and I'm sure maybe in an event like this, you start feeling that way. The more that you start learning about succession planning, or the more you learn about, temperatures of the soil, or what different types of seed types, you realize the more I learn, the more I feel like I don't know enough. And when I go out to talk with PhD students and I'm out in the world, I often refer to this as the trough of disillusionment, right? Where people are just, I don't know that I'm ever going to come out of this. But I assure you, if you keep going, if you work hard, you will come back up on that confidence in your expertise. But here's the problem, right? When people are making all of their judgments about how they feel about farming in the modern world, they don't get past this point. So their confidence in what they know is really, really high, and yet they're not going to go study enough to hit that trough where they go down. And so that helps us start to wonder, well, how is it that people know what it is that they know beyond just what they learn, right? And we've come up with this graphic to kind of describe how it is that people know what they know. And it came about from studying this artificial intelligence researcher out of MIT. His name's Yosha Bach. He's this totally nerdy guy that you would exactly expect would be studying something like, we want to get computers to think like human beings. So if we're going to do that, we have to understand, how do human beings know what they know? And so he went and he studied for about 10 years. And he came back in a conference and he said, guys, I've got this amazing revelation. After 10 years of studying, we have discovered that human beings know hardly anything at all, right? And really, what they do is human beings know one or two domains very deeply. We know something because that's how we make a living or how we get along in the world. We know one or two things really deeply, but then, for almost everything else in our lives, we rely on our tribe to tell us how to think about things. What do I mean by a tribe? Well, when we talk about tribes, we're saying we gather together, particularly now that there is the internet age, not just by where we live, but by how can I find information about topics that matter to me, about the things that I value. And maybe it's because in the city people are going to yoga together or a farmer's market, or maybe you go and you care about the same sports teams, or maybe you're really interested in the same kind of hobbies, right? Those people all gather around and you start to synchronize your beliefs about other things. So imagine you're out in the world, you've never met a farmer, you don't know a scientist, and you encounter some idea that says, did you know that chemicals are being used to grow our food? Well, no, I didn't know that. So I'm going to say, I don't know if that's good or bad. I know I should have a reaction. So I'm going to turn to my tribe and I'm going to ask them, how do we feel about that? And when I say I'm going to ask them, I mean I'm going to go on Google and I'm going to ask it, and I'm going to trust certain sites that look like sites that I would go to, or I'm going to go and ask the people that I see at my at the PTA, or maybe at my kids' soccer game. Whatever answer these people come back with, if they say something like, well, pesticides are poison, they'll kill us all, right? Then the person that goes to put that out into society, they're not putting that idea out there as a symbol of something that they know deeply. They're putting it out there as a symbol of their group loyalty, of their tribal loyalty. And so if somebody comes along, like a farmer or a scientist, and they see that that person has put a bad idea out on social media, and they shoot at that idea saying, no, that's wrong, and let me tell you why, the person that put that idea out there doesn't view it as you shooting at their idea. They view it as you shooting at their tribe. Do you like having your tribe shot at? They don't either, right? And it's really, really important that we recognize that, because it helps us understand how big this challenge is, right? If you go out and imagine that what you're going to do on social media, or the way that you're going to change conversations is by going and arguing with people, it's not going to happen. And it's not just my opinion. This is backed up by research. It's not the way that you change the way that people think and feel about things. And so you may be asking yourself, well, then what am I supposed to do if I can't argue with the facts and I can't tussle about reality? What am I going to do? And I'm going to say something here, and I'm not sure how much you guys have heard this before, but it's something that I think maybe needs to change in the agriculture community, which is farmers have been told for years and years and years, tell your story. Tell your story. How many of you have heard that? Tell your story. I think it's meant for the right thing. I think it's a good goal, but I think it's off by just a little bit. People don't want to hear your story. They want to be told a story, right? They want to be told a story that resonates with them and that they can learn from. And if you really think about the core of the stories that you listen to, that you like, that you learn from, they're not about somebody telling you about them. They're about somebody telling you something about yourself. And maybe I can give you an example. I thought about this on my drive last night about which story I could maybe tell that would illustrate this. And I started to think of a story from when I lived in Kenya. And it actually started before I went to Kenya. When I was about 18 years old, a young girl that I had gone to kindergarten with and grown all the way up with had died in a terrible car accident. It was awful. And it was one of the very first times that I had ever had to go to a funeral and had to be an adult, right? At 18, you're not allowed to just show up and hide behind your mother's skirt. You have to show up and say something, right? You have to look in the eyes of your other friends or her parents. You have to say something. But at 18, you're still kind of a kid. So I remember going to my mother and saying to her, "Mom, what am I going to say to Lindsay's parents when I get through the line? What are you supposed to say?" And I remember her advice being something that I hated so much, I thought she was dodging my question, that I left the house and I went to the funeral mad at my mother. And it wasn't until I got all the way to Africa that I learned what my mother was saying. You see, I was living in this small, remote village, and my job was to help people learn how to prevent malaria. But when you live in the Peace Corps and you're in a small village, you get invited to be a part of the community, and so you need to go do community events. And it wasn't until that happened, many years later, when I'm living in Kenya, that I went to my second funeral as an adult. A person in another village or the town over had died. And so the man that was my host, Daniel, had said, "Vance, we need to go and say pole to him." Now, pole is the term that everyone uses if somebody gets sick or someone dies. You go to their home and you say pole. And so Daniel and I get dressed and prepared to go to this funeral. And I didn't realize at the time that we were going to have to walk all the way down this giant valley through a jungle, jump over a river, walk all the way back up it. It took hours. And then we get to this place where there's a funeral at the home. And we go there, and it's inside of this village. It's all like adobe houses and wooden fences. And so we walk through the wooden fence, and you see that everybody is gathered, and the men are at this table, and the women are at this one, and the men sit there, and people come and bring tea and food, and you're just kind of waiting. And it seemed to me that everybody was just waiting for something. So Daniel and I sit down there, and somebody brings me a cup of tea, and I drink it. And then I think, okay, maybe we're going to now go say pole to the widow. But we don't. I finish that cup of chai, and they bring me another one, and I think, well, maybe I'll drink this a little faster so we can get done with that, go say pole, and leave, right? Because it's time to get home. And instead, what we do is they keep going cup after cup of chai, and they just won't stop, and I don't know what to do. And finally, after being there for hours, Daniel stands up, and he motions to me that it's time to go. So we pick ourselves up, and we leave. And I was like, "Daniel, what are we doing? We didn't go say pole. The widow is right there. We need to go say pole." And he just kind of brushed me off. And so we start going down the hill, down the valley, and I'm like, "Daniel, what are you doing? You forgot. We never went to say pole to the widow." And he continued to blow me off. So now I'm mad at him, and I'm hyper-caffeinated because I've been drinking all of this tea. So I'm kind of stomping through the jungle and stepping over these roots, and eventually I trip on a root, and I start to fall. And Daniel turns, and he says, "Vance, pole, pole." And in an instant, I realized what had just happened and how my mother, what she had said so many years ago, was exactly right. You see, in Swahili, the language that I had learned, the language that they spoke in this village, pole means I'm sorry, but pole pole means be slow, go slower. What my mother had said to me so many years ago is, "Vance, when you stand up to talk to Lindsay's parents, it won't matter what you say. No one will remember what you said. They will only remember that you were there." And in that instant, in that totally different culture, all the way far away, thousands of miles from my mother, I had this revelation that made so much of more of my life make sense. And I wrote that down one time before I came to Monsanto. And I posted it up on a blog when I was running a communications company. And I just forgot about it. And then suddenly it started to move up the ranks in Google. And it became the #1 article that people would search for when they say, what should I say at a funeral? And it started bringing in business. I started getting clients from it, right? People that would say, hey, I read your article. I want to talk with you more about your business. It had literally nothing at all to do with communications other than this description of these words, and yet people read it, they felt like they learned something from it, and now they wanted to be closer or learn more from me. This is a lesson that you all can learn, because it means that when you tell your story, you're not telling your story, you're telling someone a story that they can learn from. And if you can get good at doing this, instead of feeling like, I always have to talk about my ranch, I always have to talk about growing or the combine or how things are going, you're going to miss the point. Really, people want to connect on a deep level with the stories that teach us something. You can build entire worlds out of curiosity, right? Imagine as we were talking about that trail going down the path and back up it, as I was talking about the adobe buildings and the wooden fences around it. Each one of you built that world in your head. And you might be better at it than I am. Maybe you're really good at writing and building entire worlds. It's why books are better than movies, right? Because the reason that people love books so much is that when they read a book, they marry together what the author wanted you to see with all of your experiences together. So you build a world that's much bigger than you could ever put together in CGI. So remember that the power of storytelling is that you can create any world that you want, including a world on your farm. So if you're not great at taking photographs, you can create the image of what it's like to live on a farm in a very different way. Also, tension is created by the unknown, right? There were things about that story. First of all, you were probably wondering, why is he telling me a story about funerals at a conference about farming? But there's also another thing, which is, remember when I dropped the idea that my mother said something that I didn't know what it meant, and then we left that idea and we walked all the way through to Africa and we did something else, right? If you can create some reason for people to come with you on that journey when you're telling your story, then you're able to pull them along so that they will listen to your entire story in a very different way. And then watching a hero overcome something teaches the listener. Now, I was going to change that word, hero, because in that story I'm not a hero, right? But really a hero is anyone that is able to go through a transition, that faces something that they were not prepared for and learns something coming out of it. When you're going to tell your story or going to tell me a story, remember that if you have a lesson of transition, places where you failed, times when you did not succeed, or celebrating when people did succeed that you didn't think against all odds that they could, people will learn from it. That experience of having that aha moment builds trust in people's minds. And that trust is the thing that you're looking to get. That trust is the thing that when somebody encounters a new idea and they don't know what to do with it, and they turn to this group, you want them to trust you as a part of that group, and being able to tell stories is the way to do it. Now, this seems like the very long way to get to talking about social media, but I wanted to put that idea out there because internet artifacts are almost all stories. All of the things that we encounter on the internet are the ways that people tell, how is the world constructed around me? How should I interact with it? And so I wanted to maybe take the rest of the time and start trying to test ideas on maybe you think this way, or maybe you would be good at this, to try and start creating internet artifacts that you might not expect that you could do. Because it'd be one thing if I said, you should go out and start a podcast. And you'd be like, I don't want to start a podcast. I don't know how to do that. Blah, blah, blah. But maybe another way to think of it is, how many of you are really good at just chatting, calling somebody up and having a good conversation? Or being the person at a table that just starts asking and probing and trying to find out what the other people at the table think of things, right? Imagine that that is actually all that a podcast is. Two people having a discussion about something that's interesting. And I know that deep in the agricultural community, you guys are good at probing and asking questions and developing and figuring out how to talk with one another. And I think that this person, and I'm going to show some names, I hope you guys write them down, or if you're on Twitter, just pull your phone out and follow them, because I want to show you some examples of people that are doing it well, because if you go watch what other people are doing well, you may be able to find what you could do well or how you could imitate it. This guy right here, his name is Rob Sharkey, the Shark Farmer Podcast. How many of you have heard of the Shark Farmer Podcast? All right, a few. This is probably the most popular informal podcast in the farming world in the United States right now. And it might be one of the most popular farming podcasts in the world. And it's from an Illinois corn farmer named Rob Sharkey, who decided he was just going to start interviewing people about their day-to-day lives. And really, when you go to there, you see that he's that guy that's always poking you and teasing you and giving you a hard time about stuff. But in that conversation, in that churn, he ends up pulling things out of people, like what happened when your parents got a divorce and the farm got split in half? Or what happened when pork prices dropped and all of a sudden you went from owning a farm to now taking a pressure hose and spraying out other people's pig barns? Right? There's something deep here. And maybe it's really good for the ag tribe just to get good at listening and hearing about this, but also I've introduced this to people that are in Boston and in DC, and people living in the city love it because this is literally the only farmer that they know. Another person is Jenny Schweigert. She has a podcast called Keeping Ag Real. And she's very interesting because she's, I guess she's also from Illinois. I didn't mean to pick two Illinois people, but she often has opportunities to go to conferences, and because she's got this light, non-aggressive personality, you wouldn't believe the people that would do interviews with her, including the dean of the Harvard School of Agricultural Sciences and Agribusiness, right? So she was able to have a conversation with somebody teaching the most elite students in the United States about agriculture and find out, what does she actually think of agriculture? Right? This is really important, and it's not just important for you guys to hear what's going on, but her personality is 180 degrees different than Rob's. So you don't necessarily have to approach a podcast in the same way that Rob does. You can do it in the way that's the most comfortable for you. And it starts with just headphones. Right? If you take an Apple set of headphones, they've got that little microphone, you're just going to need a computer and two people to have some headphones to record it. Start trying things out, and if you see, hey, this is working, or I figured out how to go all the way to uploading it to iTunes or uploading it to some other podcast, then you can start to say, that was good, that was fun, and I'm going to take it up another notch, and I'm going to take it up another notch. Nobody starts out at 100% professional. So you want to try, just start with headphones. I'm guessing in this room, from all of the dancing and drinking that I saw last night, that there are some people in here that like to tell a good joke and have a good time, right? That's something that can show up on social media. That's something that can be a part of this creating internet artifacts. In fact, there's this one guy that I find particularly hilarious that goes by Faber84, dfaber84 on Twitter. His tweets, he's a dairy farmer out in Washington State, get tens of thousands of retweets and likes, and they're about all different sorts of things, right? They're about like jokes like this one. My wife got me this cool remote start thing that starts the car when it's cold and turns up the heat and fills it with gas. It's me. I'm the remote start, right? The reason this is so important is he's not sitting there saying, let me tell you about my dairy farm, let me tell you about all these things, but he puts a few jokes in there, and he starts attracting people that say, who is this guy? I like him. His sense of humor is like my sense of humor. And then they start to see that he's a farmer. So he starts getting invited by different groups to come give talks. He gets called by the New York Times to comment on things about the dairy industry. He gets asked to represent the other side in debates with animal rights organizations. Jokes that he put out on Twitter made him able to connect with the rest of the world. So maybe you are good at telling jokes. Maybe you are good at writing things or being a little bit quippy. And one of the best things about him is that he lets other people participate in the joke. He's not sitting there mocking other people. He's saying, let me tell you things that are funny that we can all laugh about, that we all see, and that brings more and more and more people into his world. And then, this is an interesting one. Do you wish someone was with you? I have a friend, his name is Matthew Schleiger. he is a rice farmer out in Sacramento, California. And if you guys have ever been out to the rice fields of Sacramento, it's this amazing thing because for most of human history, since people have started growing rice, there's been one person right here planting and picking up water, and if you picked your head up, maybe somebody would be 50 feet away also doing the same thing. Right? But now, because of industrialization, because of the machineries, you can actually tend hundreds of acres of fields. And so this guy figured out that he was working in the rice fields and he would pick up his head, and in all directions, as far as he could see, there was no one else there. And he described it as this feeling, we use this word thalassophobia, as though you are in such a giant, great, wide open space and you see how small you are that you feel claustrophobic. And so what Matt decided he was going to do is, instead of feeling alone because he couldn't bring other people out into the rice fields, he was going to start recording himself planting rice and going through all the steps and talking about what it was like to be with his wife and showing all of the aspects of it. And it's allowed him to bring other people to his fields with him. For example, right here, Matt is saying in 3, 2, 1, and the plane flies over, and then right behind him you see thousands of little water droplets hit the water, and it's that plane planting rice. And in this particular video, I think this one had a few thousand views, but he's also getting his views out to all kinds of people. My wife now is intimately aware of all the things that go on with California rice farming because every Sunday morning we watch Matt's videos. These are internet artifacts that change how people know who a farmer is. Or this woman here, her name is Sandy Brock. She has a YouTube channel called Sheepishly Me, and she just uses her YouTube channel as a diary, as a way to say, oh, we were shaving the wool, or we were trimming hooves, or we were doing all these different tasks, and she records them, and she also talks about, this is the accounting, this is what I'm doing. And they treat it both as a way to say, I'm not alone here, there's other people with me. And maybe that's you. Maybe you would like to have somebody in the experiences of you being in the cab and you don't want to be alone all the time. Or maybe you really love food, right? And it's one thing for you to say, well, I'm going to write cookbooks, or I'm going to talk about or share photos of my food, but that's a space that's really been well developed. There are a lot of people doing that, but there are some people that are doing interesting things about food. This woman here, her name is Rachel Loudon, and she writes a blog. She's a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and she often writes about a plea for culinary modernism. She's saying, look, everyone, we've been told that the French have been eating baguettes and croissants in the past, and now, because we've had modernity, everything is worse, and we've lost this grand utopia that used to be there. But she's saying, no, that's not actually true. Let me tell you what people used to cook with. And so she'll go through cookbooks, and she'll show how if you bought a cookbook in the 1930s, they were using lard. And why were they using lard? And how cookbooks were regional, and why things have changed in the way that they have. I give you this example not because you should expect that you can do this, but you may have a different perspective on cooking, or a way to talk about the way that your parents did cooking, or a way to talk about why you think food is changing the way that it is. Read this as a way to say there is an infinite number of ways that you can start creating internet artifacts, and no single way will be the right way because the 7.5 billion people in the world today don't all read the same things, but some portion of them might encounter the internet artifact that you create. You should write or produce the things that you're interested in, particularly the things that you're curious about. Those things are the ones that you'll become passionate about, and you can figure out how to make it better and better over time. But don't worry about getting it right the first time. So I'm going to conclude with this statement of connect with others. If you remember what I was saying about the tribes, that people don't actually know deep things, they just encounter questions and they turn to people. The question is there something that you can create that will jump you into another tribe? Right, into a group of people that maybe don't necessarily care that you're a farmer, but they are interested in what you know about being a mechanic, or they do really like your sense of humor. If you can do that, if you can find a way to connect with other tribes, you'll be able to put out internet artifacts that impact them, and they will spread them out for you. They will share them with other people and build that trust so that when people encounter tough questions, they have you as someone to look for in their tribe. So thank you very much for listening this morning.